I took the money and I focused on growth and I grew the business. Put my home down as collateral. We were 24 hours away from being homeless. It was a mistake that I sleepwalked into. I grew up in a very traditional Indian community and I was very rebellious. Culture of hard work, having the belief that you can make something work, taking risk. I'd always held this very strong view of what women could do. You don't really know how to build a business until you do it. Making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and doing it quite young when I didn't have a huge amount at stake. That's quite an incredible lesson. I didn't have family money to fall back on.
From director of ops all the way up to CEO at Truver.
We scaled to 50 markets. The difference in roles between a founder and a CEO, and having been both, they are so different.
Yeah, exactly.
Being a founder is exhausting. In this market, that should be on every founder's radar.
Welcome to today's episode. I'm so happy that you've tuned in. If this is your first time here, then welcome. This is the show all about how to scale and fail in business. Please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. And if you're tuning back in, then I'm so happy to have you back here. Okay, I have a truly astounding guest for you all right here. I cannot believe the intro that this woman has. Just hold on to the edge of your seat while I rattle off this one. Okay, are you ready for this? Dimple Patel is the Cambridge, Yale and Harvard educated, exited founder, ex-CEO of Trouva, and now CEO at NatureMetrics, which is a world-leading intelligence platform that generates biodiversity insights trusted by more than 500 companies in 104 countries, all to report on their nature impact, bringing scalable solution to biodiversity monitoring. Recognized as a top Asian in ImpactTech UK 2024, Dimple, welcome to the show. Should we just kiss the ground that you walk on, or?
Thank you. That was a fantastic intro.
Well,
thank you so much for having me here.
It's the reality of all of your tremendous accolades. So genuinely, what a pleasure to sit opposite you here today. With you, I want to do something a little bit different. Seeing as I'm sat across such a genuinely extraordinary guest, I want to go all the way back to the beginning. What were some of your earliest influences that influenced you to become the high achiever that you are today?
That's a really good question, actually. I think there's something quite interesting about when we talk about high performance or high achievement. It feels really objective. It feels like you have to be the leader in your field or you have to be the CEO of a company. Actually, achievement is relative to the hand that you are dealt. And so when I think about high performance and high achievement, actually a lot of that came from my parents, particularly my dad. My parents are both first generation immigrants. They never finished school. They moved to the UK very young and worked incredibly hard to build a life for themselves here. And I think there was just that kind of culture of hard work. There's having the belief that you can make something work, taking risk. You know, they didn't speak the language. My dad slept on cardboard boxes when he arrived. So it was instilled in me very, very young that when you set your sights on something, you really go for it. But then almost kind of counterbalancing that, I grew up in a traditional Indian community, and I was very rebellious when I was younger. And it was almost like I was just looking for boundaries that I could push and things that I could say no to. And I refused to learn how to cook. And, you know, I'd always held this very strong view of what women could do, which ran counter to what I was getting from a lot of my community as well.
That's so interesting. A bit of nature and nurture there. I'm kind of picking up on.
Yeah.
Can I ask, do you have siblings?
I do.
Whereabouts are you in the pecking order?
I'm the eldest.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, okay.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Me too. We're both, I think, eldest daughter syndrome. There's definitely something there.
Yeah. So I would say it was that. My parents were super supportive of me and a lot of my pushback growing up. I read a lot. I read really broadly. And I think that's really important, particularly when we look at the world today. There's so much technology, there's so much screen time, etc. But actually being able to build those worlds, have that imagination and that creativity, a lot of that does come from reading very young. And actually that was really kind of the foundation for me. Then opened up education, all of the opportunities that followed. But I'd say those are kind of the three key pieces that have shaped me into who I am.
I love that. It does make sense. Obviously, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But what I'm picking up on there is like that rebellious rebellious streak, coupled with the risk-taking, the resilience that you were exposed to with your parents, and then, of course, the intellectual side of you as well, which has all formed this kind of entrepreneurial CEO leader that you are today. So what got you into business? I mentioned that you're 3 times exited founder, which is just extraordinary. Again, you know, for anyone, let alone a woman of color. So we're going to try and cram in as much as possible today. But your first business was Love Coffee. So what got you into that? What sparked the entrepreneurial spirit in you?
Yeah. So I actually started my career in banking. I was a trader. I walked onto a trading floor in 2008. So you could say I have the world's worst possible timing. But actually, it taught me a huge amount about strategy, managing risk, taking risk, being able to connect up different data points and really making decisions. But then I always knew that I wanted to build something. And particularly with business, it's something that you can do an MBA, you can go and study it. You don't really know how to build a business until you do it. And with Love Coffee, that really came about because I didn't have any experience, I didn't have a network, and I didn't have any funding.
Wow.
And it was 2009. There was a pretty deep recession happening. And that provided the opportunity to pick up a failed business and see if I could turn that around.
Oh, interesting.
And the challenge that I set myself, so on the one hand, I had this incredible education that provided me with a safety net. And a lot of people don't have that. So I always knew that, you know, if my business failed, I'm sure somebody was going to employ me to do something somewhere. So that kind of provided a baseline to take that risk. But then if I was able to take a business that somebody else had thought could not work and make that work, actually make it into a profitable business that had some growth prospects, that's quite an incredible lesson.
Yeah,
and that's something that I can take with me going forward. And there again was that element of I want to do something that somebody else couldn't do. And it was, you know, on a relatively small scale. But again, threw myself in there. I worked, working the trading floor Monday to Friday, cleaning toilets on the weekend and serving customers and all the things that come with working in hospitality. But it is incredibly humbling.
Yeah.
As well.
So what made you decide to take over and turn around an existing business as opposed to starting one yourself?
No one would give me any money.
Okay.
Yeah, if you take on an existing business, it's already shut down. There's not a lot of capital that you have to put in. I was still burdened with a lot of student debt at that point.
Oh,
you
wow.
know, I didn't have family money to fall back on, and I didn't have a network that I could go to and say, let me raise some family and friend funds. So, you know, it would either be a very, very long period of trying to bootstrap something, which realistically you're looking at 2 to 3 years, or I take on something where there are already assets that I can start working with. So that was effectively the quickest route to market for me.
Can I just quickly check? I'm not sure if you remember, but how many years into your trading career were you at this point?
2. So about a year and a half.
Because I'm just wondering with if you're still in student debt, you're still repaying those loans. And then I'm just thinking about those risk factors that you're looking at that point in time. I think it's really fascinating that you went down that route because I think people, you don't know what you don't know. And if you're not exposed to these options, it's something that I don't really hear that much, the option of going in and taking over and turning around another existing business. I feel like it's one or the other. It's like, this is my career and then I'm going to start my own thing on the side. So I think that's really interesting. It's really refreshing to hear that actually you took that journey. Was it a concept that was already familiar to you at that point? Did the opportunity present itself?
I mean, I think also the startup ecosystem didn't exist
in
the same way that it exists today. I mean, we're going back 15 years here.
Exactly. So you got that as
it was a
well.
very different world at that point.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't so much kind of, I'm going to move into tech and I'm going to build a tech startup. All businesses to some degree were considered equal. And I think at that point, you know, it was a situation where I knew that even if this doesn't work, I'm going to learn a lot from it.
To treat it more as a learning opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that.
You know, I didn't think that this was going to be a business that, you know, would scale to the extent that I would retire, et cetera, et cetera. For me, it was really the first step on the ladder. Even if it's successful, great. Even if it fails, I also knew that I would happily go and take a job in a supermarket and stack shelves because I grew up stacking shelves. So, you know, there's an element of, like you say, you don't know what you don't know, but actually working at Goldman, I became very aware of what I did. know. Very aware that, you know, the background that I came from, there was a lot that I had not learnt. There's a lot that I had not been exposed to. So there was also an element of putting myself out there, getting that exposure, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and doing it quite young when I didn't have a huge amount at stake.
Right.
So I would definitely say that this really was to learn, to get knocked about a bit.
Get the mistakes out the way early on.
Exactly. And then be able to take all of that for whatever was going to follow in my career.
Yeah, amazing. Dimple, we're only at the start of your story and I'm already like starry-eyed and so impressed that you went and did this while having this trading career. I'm just amazed. So I know that there's so many more that I want to try and get through. So to close off the Love Coffee chapter here, what were your top 3 lessons in that turnaround?
Oh, the first one, people. Business is about people. They are, and I'm really an introvert. So I started absolutely terrified of customers, which was quite an interesting situation.
Had you ever had any hospitality roles before then? I'm guessing not.
No.
Scary.
No, genuinely, I was terrified. Whenever a customer would walk up and want to buy a coffee, I was like, oh my God, I have to talk to them. But it taught me that fundamentally business is about people.
Yeah.
And that's everything. That's from your team, your suppliers, your customers, your business partners, everything. People want to do business with people that they like.
So how did you get over that as an introvert? Was it very much just like throwing yourself in at the deep end? You've just got to get over it? Or?
No, it's stand there and serve hundreds and hundreds of customers a day.
Face your fears.
And I think, you know, with the team, it was kind of really getting stuck in, earning their respect. And I think, you know, you have to really understand the people that you're working with, and earning different people's respect comes in different ways as well. And I think that is definitely a lesson that I've carried with me throughout every other business that I have grown, is that people sit at the centre of everything and don't ask anybody else to do something that you wouldn't do yourself, which is where the cleaning of the toilets came in.
Yeah.
And the second piece is actually running and growing a business, particularly one that had quite a simple business model, which was one of the draws to starting a coffee business. Also, 15 years ago, coffee was quite a hot industry in the UK. Is you spend less time in the algorithms and the complexity of, you know, the logic that you might be trying to build with a software application, and much more time actually understanding the fundamentals of finance. Like, I was not the most attentive accountant when I was trying to learn the ins and outs of it as part of my Goldman training. I can tell you now the value that sits behind every line of a balance sheet and a P&L, and how to read it and how to extract the information and why it's important. And actually that has been fundamental for fundraisers, for exits, acquisitions, the whole lot. So actually taking what you see in the various lines of those financial documents and seeing them come to life was incredibly valuable.
I love that.
And I'd say probably the third thing is managing real life risk. So I went from Goldman, where the risk was somebody else's money, that was Goldman money. And it was quite abstract, you know, it was numbers on a screen, you make your trades, the numbers move up or down, and that basically flows through as you either make money or you lose money. And that taught me a lot about kind of strategies, management, hedging, etc. But actually in the real world, the risk that you take costs people's jobs.
Yeah.
That was very real with Love Coffee. The decisions that I make didn't just impact me. They didn't just impact the numbers on my P&L sheet. They impact people's livelihoods. And being able to carry that responsibility and manage that risk and make business decisions that were aligned with the best interest of the business, but emotionally could be incredibly difficult and quite heavy and challenging. And again, something that particularly when you look at some of the what's happened with the kind of the wider markets and COVID and all the things that have followed, actually the toll and the stress that you have from building and building companies and making these decisions was something that I had to face quite young.
Yeah, and I think especially if it's a small team as well and you literally know each other
Yes.
and you do make that small talk between the shifts, it makes it even more real, right?
Yeah,
These
and you
are
know about their
individuals.
families
Yeah.
and every decision that you make and the consequences of all of those decisions is so real.
Has that knock-on impact. And I just want to underscore before we move on here as well, like the beauty of the simplicity of a coffee business in this instance. I love that because I think we can get too kind of, shoulders up about things. I love looking at a basic business where it's customers coming in off the street, buying a latte or a macchiato. These are the pricing. This is how many we need to turn over. These are our unit economics. I love that simplicity, especially if it's your first business, to really get that like good grasp on the fundamentals, as you say. I love that. All right. So moving along, the next chapter is your journey at Truver, which was the furniture business, right? I'm sure you've got a better elevator pitch for the business. So you started off as director of operations, and I think it's really fascinating to hear a little bit about how you worked your way up to that position of CEO. So we were just saying before, it's so frequent to find the CEO is the founder, or it's one and the same, but actually as the business grows, those two job titles become, very different things. So what was the unique skill set that took you from director of ops all the way up to CEO at Truver?
Yes, so I think simple answer would be that I had done that cycle before. So I had been a founder. So that meant that I understood the challenges of being a founder of a company. I understood the emotional attachment that you have where that company is effectively an extension of yourself. So that really helped my relationship with the founders as well. But having been on that journey, scaled a company right the way through to exit, you learn a lot along the way that almost changes some of the decisions that you make earlier on. So when you're thinking about strategy, you're thinking about sequencing, the second and third order implications of the decisions you're making, you will think through slightly differently to somebody that is doing it for the first time. The other piece is how quickly you can come to a conclusion in terms of how you might solve a problem. If you are solving everything for the first time, again, that takes longer.
Yeah.
So I'd say, that was definitely an advantage. Second-time founders, anybody that had scaled a company before that then goes on to do it again, there's a huge amount of muscle memory that you take with you. And then beyond that, I would just say, I had a fantastic team. I mean, that Truva team it just blew my mind. It was the most incredible team that I had ever seen come together.
Wow.
It was a group of people where you walk in and you think, I found my people.
Wow, I love that.
And actually what that meant was the relationship and the level of trust in that team was really, really high. And that made us really highly functioning, not just individually, but as a team.
And so to unpack that for a moment, is that more along the cultural side of things, like how well you all gelled together, or is there anything else in what made you all such a high-performing team? Quick one. This is future Steph coming to you from beyond. If you're enjoying this episode, then you can probably guess what I want you to do. Please do me one tiny favor that costs you nothing and takes a second of your time. Hit that subscribe button. It really helps to support this show, and I'm really grateful for you listening. Let's get back into it. And so to unpack that for a moment, is that more along the cultural side of things, like how well you all gelled together, or is there anything else in what made you all such a high-performing team?
Probably a few things. So I think culture is a really, really big part of that. And culture is everything from, your ways of working, what systems you use, down to how you communicate, how you give feedback, alignment behind certain values, alignment behind what high performance looks like, and also the ability to put the business first. To come together in a room, make a decision that you align is the right decision for the business. And obviously there will be people in that room that are impacted very differently based on that decision, but they will take that away knowing that it is the right thing to do. They will go away, they will deliver that, they will communicate it.
Yeah. Helps put the ego to one side, doesn't it?
It was incredibly low ego. So there was that piece. There was also kind of diversity of backgrounds. And, I learned so much from the people around me. Everything from, what incredible brand and product we have on Trouva.com, because we had people that were literally there all day finding things, through to travel, music, culture. There was so much. It was so rounded. And that was it was such a vibrant environment to be working in.
I can just tell in your body language and your facial expressions, I feel like this is quite a nice sort of bit of nostalgia in your journey as well. I can tell how fondly you're thinking back to that time. What I'm also curious about here is how different your role, I'm guessing, must have been as CEO of Truver at the point that the business was at, at kind of scale up phase. I'm not sure exactly sort of team size and, funding round labels, which I'd love to hear about. That's a different ball game, I imagine, to however far you managed to take Love Coffee. So what were some of the new challenges that you had to face at that kind of scale up CEO level?
Yeah, so I think they were broadly comparable. If you take something like headcount, actually the headcount at Love Coffee was higher than where we were at Truva. So it really depends on kind of how you measure scale. I think when you look at what Truva provided that Love Coffee didn't, was that international component. So we scaled to 50 markets. So there's a huge element of kind of cross-border shipments, tax regimes, all of that complexity that comes in. Having teams that are based in different countries and locations as well, which was really interesting. So there were a lot of kind of new pieces there. Obviously, Truva was a technology company. Love Coffee wasn't. We did have a physical component to what we were doing because we were shipping. It was still retail, etc. So it was quite nice to build on areas that I already knew, I was familiar with. I had the confidence to know that I had done before. But then almost layer on new aspects, new delivery mechanisms, go-to-market strategies that just kind of kept me moving forward, but didn't feel completely unknown.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that. And it feels like a very natural next progression for you, right? Where it's not totally the unknown, but there's just that extra element of a new challenge for you to get your teeth stuck into. From the founder's perspective, do you know what led up to the decision to make, not yourself individually, but to place a separate CEO?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I know you touched on it earlier, but the difference in roles between a founder and a CEO, and having been both, they are so different.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm actually at the stage in my career when I left Truva that I said, do I want to go back to being a founder? Do I want to continue being a CEO? And chose to continue being a CEO. Being a founder is exhausting. You're running at a pace that it is very difficult to sustain over a long period of time. And particularly those early days when you have uncertainty of funding, you have uncertainty of product market fit, you have all of the challenges of bringing together an early team, you're taking a huge amount of risk. There is always, there's an inevitability that as companies scale, founders will want to step back. They have put absolutely everything of themselves into a company. And I think that's really where we got to at Truva. It's also, what we have with NatureMetrics. I mean, Kat is incredible. She's an absolute visionary in the space, and has spent 8 years getting the business to where it is today. But that is 8 years. That's probably about 20 years when you think about the
founder.
pace. When you think about
it's
the
like
pace
dog
that
years,
you have
isn't
to
it?
run at.
That's a fantastic point, isn't it? A year in founder years is actually like 7.
Yes.
That makes sense. So you say actually 8 years with NatureMetrics. We'll come on to this current chapter with NatureMetrics as well in just a sec. But with Truva as well, I'm just curious, how many years had it been before you were brought in as CEO or promoted to CEO?
I think at that point, the company was founded so they first started, they had a couple of pivots in the early days, as kind of most founders do. But I think they started in 2013.
Yeah, wow.
So by that point, by the time COVID hit, they've been doing it for 7 years.
Yeah, wow.
And 2021, 22 is when I started to take over the running of the company. That's still 8-9 years in.
Yeah. So I asked you kind of to summarize sort of the top lessons from your Love Coffee chapter, but a similar question with Truva before we move on as well. For anyone who is a bit further along, who is in that scale up stage or looking to go international, can you share sort of the top, again, 1 to 3 things that you've carried with you from your experience at Truva?
Yeah, sure.
As it relates to scaling growth.
Yeah, so Truva was really interesting because it was e-commerce, homewares right at the peak of COVID. And I would say there are a few things that really taught me. So one is unit economics. And generally, unit economics in early stage technology companies are really poor. And it takes a lot of very active effort to get your unit economics to a point of sustainability. I think in this market, that should be on every founder's radar because the funding is not infinite and it will run out if the unit economics are not sustainable. We got the business to a point of break even with the COVID boom. We made a lot of changes. Our unit economics was quite an important part of the driving factor behind the acquisition as well. So even as you're preparing your business for exit, really think about the underlying fundamentals, because when somebody buys you, they're taking on what that future financial performance is going to look like.
Yeah.
But your current financial performance will also determine what your acquirer does with your business.
Yeah.
It determines whether they keep all of your team, whether they decide to do a full integration or merger, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those were some of the really interesting pieces. And particularly behind that, your customer acquisition costs. Like, how do you grow your company? How do you build sustainable acquisition mechanisms that mean that you are not running a growth at all costs?
Yeah. What worked for you at Truver on that note?
So for us, a lot of it was thinking about brand, thinking about referrals, actually placing a value on customer satisfaction. And you can place a value on that because that then drives retention. But it's almost an afterthought in the sense of people thinking about it as streamlining your operations. But actually, that can be a reacquisition mechanism as well. So actually being intentional about all of those pieces as a way of growing your business, as opposed to the growth element is the marketing department and everything else is delivery.
Yeah. Music to my ears, Dimple, especially you saying the magic word of brand. I feel like I've been banging the drum on that for the past few years as well. So I'm very happy to hear that was one of the things that worked for you guys at Truva. All right, so moving on, you're now at NatureMetrics. I described what the company did. I hope I got that largely correct anyway in the introduction there. What I loved hearing you speak about with NatureMetrics is the great story about when you first joined, especially, looking at your career so far, and we've gone from coffee to selling homewares, e-commerce, and now a completely different, again, type of business. Very techie. I remember you talking about visiting the office and hearing all the scientists tell you all this awesome, deep science techie stuff. What you had to do, converting that into a sellable core value proposition. Actually, what does that mean? How can I translate this deep tech, all of this information into something that customers actually care about? So I'd love to hear more about that story and the importance, especially if anyone is in that techie world, converting the product, the tech, what you've got there, to actually why does that matter to customers?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. What I love about NatureMetrics is it actually pulls together almost every part of my career journey and rolls it up into one role.
Okay.
So you have the physical operations of Love Coffee, and we have the labs, and we have, inventory management and all kind of the kind of traditional aspects of physical operations there. We have the financial instruments and the environmental markets piece, which relate back to my Goldman days. And then obviously all of kind of the data technology scaling software pieces that we had at Truva. But fundamentally, when I think about NatureMetrics, actually, when you look at the broader market, what we're seeing within the sustainability space, particularly biodiversity, I am, to some degree, a reflection of our target client. We're trying to change the way that companies account for their impact on nature and biodiversity. And we're trying to change it at the point of the decision makers in the boardroom. So these are not people that have a PhD in ecology. These are people that are trying to manage their operational risk. They're trying to think about financial planning. They're trying to think about how they raise funding. And they're being pushed to do it in a responsible way. what are the tools that they need? How do you present information to them? How do you make it compelling enough to change their behaviors, to change the decisions that they're making? And then how do you influence all of the stakeholders around them to apply the right kind of pressure to push them in the direction of making the change that we want to see in relation to kind of nature and biodiversity as well. So that really helped.
Very much coming from that world of like, actually, what are the conversations that are happening around the boardroom tables?
Yes.
Who are those key stakeholders? Who do we need to influence to lead up to that decision? And it's actually likely not going to start from the science conversation that the guys in the office think it's going to. Right?
But also, you know, what are the priorities in the boardroom?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you want to see action, it needs to get up to the top of the list of priorities. What are you fighting against? You're fighting against, you know, inflation at one point. You're fighting against supply chain uncertainty. There's a lot of noise when you think about some of the challenges in the boardroom. Actually, you know, when you look at biodiversity and nature, particularly if you have an agricultural supply chain, there is an existential risk to your soil health being in a bad place. But actually, unless you say to somebody in the boardroom, you have an existential risk to your supply chain, they're not going to connect the dots from, you can run DNA analysis on soil and it will give you some really interesting sequencing data that then shows you your bacterial composition. You know, they're not going to connect those dots. You have to connect them for them.
Yeah.
And the technology is incredible and really powerful, which means that not only do we have the credibility when we're going to market, it means that you can stand behind all of the data and the insights that you are providing to the extent that you can say, yes, I am comfortable for you to make a multi-million-pound decision off the back of the data that I'm giving you.
Yeah.
Because I trust that what I'm giving you is high quality and high integrity. But the technology itself and the ins and outs and the mechanics of the technology is less what is going to make the clients pay attention.
It's the what, not the how, isn't it? And if we can just distill down these sales and marketing tidbits for other listeners here, can you just kind of expand a little bit more on, you know, summarize those key points there in terms of like what people care about, who are the decision makers, how you can convert the ins and outs of the product to what they care about? Just kind of that distillation, very much on like the sales and marketing, like.
Yeah. I think my key tip is keep it simple.
Yeah, exactly.
Keep it simple. Keep it simple to the point that, you know, when somebody is listening to you speak, they're probably thinking about 2 or 3 other things at the same time. So if you use too many words, if you introduce too much complexity, they will remember half of it and they will reuse none of it.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
And glaze over.
Exactly. So definitely simplify the messaging. But then also remember that the customer has got to go on a journey, you know, particularly when you look at the area that we are in and biodiversity, there's a huge amount of education that we need to provide our clients as to the importance of it, the operational simplicity of our solution, why it's, you know, important to their decision making, their operational risk management, etc. You can't give them all of that at once.
Right.
So it's really thinking then about the stages at which you communicate these things. So on the other side, you want them to be fully bought in. You want them to understand that you're the gold standard. They shouldn't work with anybody else in the market. And this is a product that they absolutely have to have in their industry and in their company. That is going to be multiple touch points.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of hand-holding that has to happen. And I think sometimes we are so excited by what we can do and the value that we can provide that we want to just word vomit it.
There is that eagerness, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah, I get that. And you present such a compelling case. I'm aware that some of the clients that you've got on your books or partners, you know, whatever term you use, but these are some big names. You've got like EDF Energy, Tesco, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Like, so I think that's another challenge for startup scale-ups when you're selling into, I guess, kind of enterprise, big corporates. You've got those long sales cycles. Part of that as well is the runway that you need, right? You're talking about taking them on that journey, different elements to communicate at different stages. Not every business has the luxury of staying around for long enough. I remember with my last business, speaking to clients, I'd sometimes get like, well, maybe we'll circle back in 6 months. Yeah. And, you know, I'd be like, I don't know if I'm going to be around in 6 months, but obviously that thought doesn't even like cross their minds. So I'm using that as a segue to the fundraising piece to touch on as well here, which from the outside looking in, you've got such an incredible track record, 3 exits under your belt, CEO positions of these hugely successful businesses, highly educated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've also got the demographics, if you like, a woman of color, et cetera, et cetera. How are you finding the fundraising process at the moment?
Good question. It's a difficult fundraising market. I think a lot of that is hangover from the highs of 2021, 2022. I think there were some poor fundraising decisions. I think everyone can say there were poor fundraising decisions made at the time in a very frothy market. And so the space has become much more disciplined. It's been much more restrained. And then in the middle of that, we've just had this AI bubble that's kind of popped up that everybody wants to invest in. So it's a difficult market. When I look at NatureMetrics, I mean, we are a market leader in our space. We've had, a 7 to 8 year head start on everybody else within the nature tech space. And we have this incredibly powerful product. Theoretically, that should be a slam dunk when it comes to fundraising. And I think it's really interesting because as a company progresses, you see those conversations with investors obviously evolve. What they're interested in, what they're looking for changes along that journey as well. So when you're super early stage, it's really all about the founder and the idea and the potential and the problem that they're going to solve and how innovative the technology is. As you get to kind of growth stages, so Series B and later, it's very much about the commercial traction. What proof points do you have? What evidence do you have of kind of that recurring going forward, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I have done more due diligence as part of this fundraise than I have done when selling companies.
Wow.
And I think that is probably a pretty fair reflection of where the market is at the moment. And whilst on the one hand, I said understanding of the fundraising process obviously gets easier the more that you do it, the process itself does not get easier, it does not get more fun.
Okay. That's good news for everyone, isn't it?
You have a better measure of what questions to expect and what questions are unusual.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yes, which is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
One, because when you're preparing the materials for your data room, you typically know what investors are going to care about. When you get the questions come in, you can look at a list of questions without freaking out, being like, oh yeah, this is fairly standard stuff. I see which angle they're kind of coming in at. We can respond to all of this. But it also means that you can spot the question that is out of place.
Yeah.
And so you almost kind of get that early read of like, that's a flag. I think that means they're on the fence.
I love that you mentioned that. And this is one of those other things, there's no shortcut to experience. You grow through what you go through. You just have to, have to amass that experience through time. And I love so much that you say that, because I have had other incredible guests on this show who've recounted the earlier days of their entrepreneurial journey, and specifically as it relates to fundraising, and how they didn't know whether it was a normal or abnormal request that was being made of them, because you don't have a benchmark, you don't have that experience. And if you don't have someone else or a handy podcast to listen to help guide you along the way, then what are you going to do, right? So you go through that, and these are the scars that people share on here. So I love that point. Quick penultimate question, which kind of, we've talked about how, draining the process, can be, especially as a founder in the early days. Just mentioning, the fundraising process doesn't get any easier. As such a high performer, again, what do you do to manage, not your time, because I feel like everyone talks about time, but your energy? How do you manage to take care of yourself? How does Dimple look after herself in these high pressure situations?
Yeah, I would love to say that I have mastered it.
Please share.
I definitely have periods where I do push things too far. I have 2 young daughters as well.
Love
so
that.
There's always a challenge of kind of trying to balance family as well as work. And so inevitably what happens is you whack everyone else up the priority list and then you're sitting somewhere along the bottom. I would say the one non-negotiable I have is sleep. I know that if I've slept and if I've rested, whilst I might not be 100% the next day if I'm stressed, not having sleep will make the following day unmanageable. So that is a one piece that I will.
And so what do you do to make sure you get a better night's sleep?
Generally, I'm a pretty good sleeper, actually. So it's more making sure that I guard bedtimes. Social lives and those kind of things. I mean, the thing is, none of this is a silver bullet. There are always sacrifices that you have to make. So, socially, you don't do that Monday to Thursday. Actually, if I'm tired, I don't do it on Friday either. There are days where sometimes kids go to bed and then I go to bed, but it means that I'm much fresher the next morning. And I think that is really, really important, because what you don't realise, particularly with poor sleep, is it compounds.
Yeah.
Until actually everything feels unmanageable.
Yeah.
But particularly when you've got conflicting priorities. So, how do I manage the guilt of missing a school event or being late to pick the kids up without kind of tearing myself to pieces? And there is the emotional element to that as well. And you have a wider team that are relying on you. So emotional regulation is a huge part of your role, both as a parent but also at work. So I think a lot of that does come down to sleep. Exercise, I think, is also an important one. But I think everybody will have their own tips and tricks that they need to just almost instill a little bit of calm. And I think the more that you can get kind of the calm and the silence. I'm an introvert, so I get my energy from those, an element of sensory deprivation. That just helps me be a better team member, a better parent, a better person on the other side.
Love that. Well, I think those are all very universal as well anyway. I definitely relate. I have a very weird sleep disorder myself, and I remember one year doing an annual reflection of the previous year of my business, and this is going back a little while ago, and there was this light bulb moment where the lowest points in the year I'd actually mapped out as having like the worst night's sleep. Everything seems so much worse when you just haven't had a good night's sleep. Dimple, very sadly, traditional closing question on this show. It's called Strategy and Tragedy. One of the reasons being that we often learn the biggest lessons, or the best lessons, from the biggest mistakes. What's one particular tragedy that you'd like to share that's taught you an unforgettable lesson?
So this definitely has got to be one of my love coffee ones. The first thing I will say is that I've made a lot of mistakes. We all do. We all have to own those mistakes. We learn from them. But I've definitely made my fair share. But what I did when I was growing Love Coffee, and this is specifically in relation to funding, was as part of securing funding, we just bought our first house. We had a young family. I think my youngest was 2 years old at the time, so still very, very young. I put my property my home down as collateral on some funding that I took on, and we went through quite a rough patch with the business, and we were 24 hours away from being homeless. Oh my God. That was the point at which professional crossed into personal in a very, very dangerous way. It was a mistake that I sleepwalked into. And again, I didn't know what was a normal term as part of getting funding and who the right people were to speak to. And, I took the money and I focused on growth and I grew the business, and I hadn't protected on the downside, and I hadn't thought that those downsides would play out. And so actually what that has done is, whilst it hasn't changed my attitude towards taking risk and growth, it has made me so much more aware of how to protect on the downside. And when you're going out for funding, your investors will always put in the downside protections. What are your downside protections? What are the business's downside protections? And so everything from reading the small print in legal contracts, looking at funding terms, even on a personal level, just being much more aware of it, is probably the lesson that I've taken from
that. That is a great lesson learned. Oh my God, I feel the stress as you're telling that story there. I feel like I need to take a breather. But thank you so much for sharing that lesson. I think also just a thought that comes up for me on that is, I think that we do go into those situations with that more optimistic mindset, with best case scenario, especially when it's those early days. You have the vision. You don't really plan for that downside. You don't really plan so much for things going wrong, because it's almost like we don't really want to think about it anyway. So thank you for highlighting that piece in particular. Dimple, an absolute pleasure to have this quality time with you. I know you're an incredibly busy woman, so thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me.
It's been great, and I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to this. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes, hopefully as great as this conversation here with Dimple. Really hope you've enjoyed this, and hopefully see you next time.